Sir, sitting in this place when the member for Christchurch East Central, the Honourable Minister of Finance, delivered the budgetary proposals and financial statement, I started to reflect that it seems like the best economist once worked in a supermarket. Because I discovered, and I thought that I may have been one of the only ones whose first job was in a supermarket. I talk often about the fact that I worked as a cashier at Carlton Supermarket when I was still at school. And in fact, one of the things that was most exciting to me about that role was that it came at a time in the life of that supermarket when they were modernizing. They had just brought on a frequent shopper program. I do remember these things because the members' intervention in delivering the budget caused me to reflect as well about where I was and what I was doing and how I felt in those moments, just as he shared with us. I remember they were introducing a frequent shopper program, which was brand new as a concept in retail, in that kind of retail sector. And they had also just moved to point-of-sale scales for weighing. And I remember that when I would go shopping with my mother in the supermarkets that we used, that you would always have to take the thing and get it weighed and then go to the cashier, and I thought that that was a bit of a nuisance. But I'm reflecting on these things because I think that me being in that position at the age of 16 or 17 and feeling excited about the fact that I was a part of this modernization of this supermarket, and that when we would do personal shopping for some of the older people in the community, that I took that very personally. I took it very personally that I knew that I needed to buy this particular brand of soap powder for this old lady and not that one. Or I took it very personally that we were in fact effectively modernizing the service delivery to people. And I say these things, sir, because I think that it is in those moments, it is while you are growing up and while you're experiencing some of the hardship that your family experiences, that it puts you in a position to be able to understand the kinds of measures that will be meaningful for people when you are then in the position that you can make a difference in their lives. One of the things I say to people all the time when people ask me, so, they ask it almost as an anthropological question, did you know that you were growing up poor or working class? And I say to people all the time, when you live in a board house on a small lot of land, everybody is next to each other. It is not possible for parents to have these private conversations about how they're going to afford things and for the children not to know. And so I start here because I realize that perhaps it is the working in the supermarket and the understanding the needs of people from an early age, understanding that, in fact, we had to work to contribute to our families. And having that experience then puts you in a good place to understand when you come to political service, the kinds of things that you need to be able to deliver for people. For me, sir, the Republic Child Wealth Fund is one such thing. I reflect often about the need now to be able to take Barbadians to raise a society and a population where when young people are starting their tertiary education careers or starting to work or starting to make those choices, that their families have something to give them. My family had to make difficult choices because they did not have that. I wonder if we understand how transformational this kind of asset will be for families like mine, for families like the member for St. Michael South, for families like the member for Christchurch East Central and others in this honorable place. That if we had that, not that we may not have worked at supermarkets, but perhaps we might have been able to take those resources and start to invest at a time when we did not have then to take those earnings home and put it in our mother's or our grandmother's hand to say, Mommy, take that, I know that you need that to help. This is a transformational measure, and the fact is that, I think sometimes that in all the drama of elections, there is this notion that manifesto promises are election PR. We talked about this measure on the platform. It is in the manifesto. And because we are a serious party and government, it is here being announced as one of the measures in this first budget of this parliamentary term. What we say to people when we are asking for their support and their vote and for us to enter a covenant together is real, and we do not take it for granted. But sir, I also want, as a point of departure, to reflect on the fact that every area of this budget, I dare say any area of any budget of this government, comes together on purpose to achieve development and transformation. I know that we call these a series of budgetary proposals, but what this is in itself is a strategy. No, it is not. It is an annual exercise, and I will come to some of the commentary that we've been hearing. It is not meant to be a medium-term or long-term strategy. There will be some elements of it whose implementation and execution are medium-term. But there seem to be some of us who believe that an annual budget should tick every box for a growth strategy or a transformation strategy. That is not what a budget is. However, this budget is transformational in that the 6 areas of proposals align for a particular purpose. We have cost of living measures, citizen security and resilience measures, growth enhancement, business, measures for people living with special needs, and investment in the future. And I talked about one of those investment in the future measures just now, the Republic Child Wealth Fund. But someone asked me of that fund, and I say this by way of illustration that this is about policy alignment in every regard. This is not just a menu of things that people can choose from and say, well, I can hold this one or I don't like this one. They are meant to operate together. Somebody asked me about the Republic Child Wealth Fund, and I mean an honest and fair question, whether I thought that families could not use the help earlier. And my response to them was, in this budget, families are getting the help earlier, because it is not just a single policy. Yeah. Across the cost of living measures, whether it is the transfer for multiple births, whether it is the reverse tax credit increase, whether it is the income tax increases in the thresholds, whether it is some of the energy subsidies whose ultimate outcome will be helping families to retain more cash, to be able to then reinvest in their households, in their children's health and education and transportation. These measures all hang together. But it is important, and that is why I do not agree with those who say that these are short-term measures. The Republic Child Wealth Fund is not a short-term measure. No. The Republic Child Wealth Fund, and if I sound like I'm staying on this one a long time, see the member of Christchurch East Central looking at me as if I don't have other things to say. But if it seems as if I'm staying on this a long time, it is because For at least 8 years, it's almost 8 years now, in this honorable place, I have spoken about the need to really address intergenerational poverty and associated with that intergenerational wealth. We have, in working class communities in Barbados, come to a place where we are not able, because of structural issues and because we had not yet by this time developed some of the tools, able to make the full use of certain kinds of assets, able to bring investment to people's real lives. And this Child Wealth Fund allows us to do that. It starts to address the fact that many families live a subsistence kind of life. And that when people are struggling on the day-to-day, it is very difficult. This is an economic principle and a social principle that we know. It is very difficult to look 18 years down the road and to start to dream about what you would like to put away for your 18-year-old. This instrument allows you to do that. It is perhaps, and I would like to think that it is, a precursor to some of the things that we will have to do with respect to estate planning and even land management and other management of assets. We know that there are too many properties across Barbados, and especially in St. Michael, that have fallen to ruin and fallen into disrepair because while they belong to somebody, the work was not done within that family to make sure that that asset was secured by the family and then could therefore be used. This budget starts to take us to that place of economic enfranchisement at the level of the household, starts to take us to that place of ensuring that we can address the intergenerational nature of deprivation that we have spoken about in this country for so long. Sir, I also, though, have to come to the notion that I've heard in the last 48 hours or so, that this budget does not deliver a growth strategy or does not speak to structural transformation. And while I don't agree that that is the case, I believe that there are measures here, as I've just outlined, that do speak to these things, and I'll come to one or two of them. But I also want to say something very clearly. This government started in 2018 with a Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan that was heavy on the recovery. And we called it recovery and transformation because we knew that at that time it would be heavy on the recovery, and that later we would be able to get to a place where we could focus more on the transformation. But we have consistently brought a BERT, first BERT, a second BERT, and now a third, that does go further with a medium-term plan, further than an annual budget is intended to go, with a medium-term plan for growth and transformation. And so this framework, along with Mission Barbados, the 6 missions that we've identified, along with the investment strategy that BERT, the third installment, makes reference to, and along with the energy policy that will also drive our investments, and including the reindustrialization plan that the budget does speak to. A budget is not intended to be an implementation strategy for the next 5 years, but it is meant to signal what are the priorities that begin in the current financial year for the government. It is not to say that those priorities begin and end in that financial year. But the BERT 3.0 does address, along with some of these other frameworks, 5 pillars that accompany this financial statement and budgetary proposals, in the way that we will, in delivering how we expect to be able to see transformation along with our partners in this country. The first pillar of BERT speaks to enhancing productivity and competitiveness. And I said when I addressed the Barbados Chamber of Commerce and Industry Post-Budget Forum this morning, I signaled to them that enhancing productivity and competitiveness has certainly been identified as job number one for the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Development. I said to them that one of the first conversations I had was with the minister. He's laughing because he knows what I'm going to say. The new Minister for Transport and Works and the Senior Minister for Infrastructure. Because the question of productivity relates to many things. It relates to workers' health and wellness and the extent to which they are made ready or afforded the tools and the environment to perform. It relates to the extent to which we can use technology and digitalization to just make people's lives easier and give people the technology that they need to work. But it importantly also relates to how we are setting ourselves up for success, how we are using infrastructure and assets to be productive and to make the country productive. And so when we talk about moving people around efficiently, when we talk about coming up with a road network that is able to deliver for people that live in Barbados, but also signal to the investment community here and abroad that we are serious about doing business in Barbados and having the economy grow. I mean, it may perhaps be a coincidence that some of the most used roads on the way to Bridgetown and to other areas of commerce are in St. Michael South Central. That might be a coincidence. So when as the minister that has responsibility for productivity, make the argument on that basis, perhaps the minister will understand that it might just be a coincidence that the whole of Barbados drives through Roberts Gap and Halls Road to get to Bridgetown. But that's a conversation for another day. And I know that he understands the productivity argument in that regard. But I make these points because the budget also speaks about the establishment of a competitiveness commission, and competitiveness commission is the language that is used in the budget. I find it lofty language because when I hear commission, I start to think that people will sit apart and make pronouncements and recommendations. And I know that the member for St. George North is not in the business of making pronouncements. So I know that that word commission maybe doesn't fit her. But I think that this is perhaps one of the most important measures. It may not be as sexy as some of the others, but it is critical to how we're able to develop. The fact is that a small economy like Barbados, in some of the established sectors, and you heard the member for St. Michael West Central speak at length about the accomplishments to date, but also these plans for the sector that this budget is able to facilitate. But the truth is that an economy like ours always comes to a point where there is not much more scale that can be achieved. And where you will get your growth is in productivity, making all of the factors in your economy more productive. There is a lot of scope in this Barbados for us to be more productive. One of the things I mentioned to the chamber this morning was that I would like to see us come to the place, and we talk about some of these indicators, and we talk about debt to GDP, and we talk about the fact that it is at just around 93%, which is a tremendous achievement given where we had come from. But the fact is that There are other indicators that we should be measuring daily. I would not say no to a productivity ticker that is placed in some conspicuous location in the country that everybody will pass. And let me tell you why. Because productivity is not just a function of what government does. It is in fact a function of what each of us does every day. My idea was to put it like Kensington Oval, because I tend to look there all the time when I pass, but not everybody might be concerned as I am with the fates of the West Indies cricket team and pass there and look longingly to the Oval and hope that it will long be a symbol of West Indies cricket dominance. But I believe that if we can bring these conversations more squarely into the public discourse, as the Competitiveness Committee, I call it, is a simple word, seeks to do, then this would be important for us. And I want to say that when I was first Minister with responsibility for economic affairs, we started this work. This is not something that is new, and it is in fact something for which we know there is an appetite among all our social partners. In fact, the two individuals who have been named to begin and to co-chair and to start to roll out the committee with us were at the time also instrumental in a lot of the reform discussions that we needed to have. And the approach of that committee, we called it a doing business subcommittee of cabinet, and then there were smaller committees. And those committees were about sitting and looking at each issue, whether it was KIPO at the time and registering a business, whether it was town planning and getting an approval, whatever the issue was. And I use the example of town planning, now planning and development, because I was also minister responsible at the time. And when we sat together to say, okay, how do we move these numbers? If this thing is taking 216 days on average, how do we get it to 14 days or 30 days, depending on the nature of the application? And it was only when we sat with people around the table who had been experiencing the system that we were able to realize, well, hang on, you might get your application approved. You might finish the process with town planning. But then you might need, before you could do anything, to have an approval from the Environmental Protection Department. And that is not actually within the scope of what town planning does. And so we had to bring them to the table. And then somebody said, well, hang on, I can't start anything because all now I'm waiting for a connection from the Barbados Water Authority. And so we had to bring them to the table. And what I'm saying here on the floor of this Parliament, the member who spoke before me made reference to it. This is an extremely robust set of measures. How we execute is what matters. A competitiveness committee has to be about having subcommittees that work together, roll up our sleeves around the table and figure out where are the nuisances and where are the bottlenecks, and have a method to do the fine work of getting these things unstuck. That is also one of the reasons that we, in this budget and in BERT 3.0, talk about having a delivery unit.
Your Honour, member has 5 more minutes.
A delivery unit is also not a new concept. Thank you, Your Honour. It's also not a new concept. But I think that we are finally beginning to see that political will alone does not get things done. I always say to colleagues that, and I have worked with governments before coming to government, governments all over the world. This government, since 2018, has had one of the highest levels of political will for transformation that I have ever seen. Unmatched. I'm not saying that just because I'm a part of it, but if I were to step back objectively and look at governments that I've worked with and for, as somebody who's worked in development finance, as somebody who's worked in the UN system, one of the highest levels of political will for reform and for transformation that I have ever seen. And yet, we are facing the reality that we have to do better with execution. The young member for Christchurch East Central talked about some of the ways that we've done better with execution. He talked about the fact that capital expenditure has actually seen some better execution and some of the execution that means that it will start to contribute to productivity. But I believe that this budget and BERT 3.0 and the discussions that we've been having confront the fact that we are going nowhere without addressing competitiveness and productivity as the channel for growth in this country. All of these things hang together. We are investing more in trust loans. Well, when we invest more in trust loans and when people get more access to trust loans, then we have another challenge that has to do with how these policies hang together and our own competitiveness. Because I remember being a consultant who was certainly making a little bit more than I'm making now. But because I was a consultant, the commercial banking system did not think that I was a worthwhile client. Mm-hmm. This is a reality of small business. And so who in the banking sector is going to sit with us, is going to sit with the member for St. George North and the former chair of the Barbados Private Sector Association and the rest of the Competitiveness Committee and talk to us about how we can make sure that there's financial stability and predictability for small business people. This is a real thing. Sir, the final point that I want to make with respect to the measures before us and also with respect to the road before us has to do with how we consider some of these social investments here. I heard a lot about the budget is giving a lot, is giving this and is giving that. And I hope that we change our register in this regard. This is a series of investments. To my knowledge, we are a little ways away from an election. We are a little ways away from an election. And as a member for Christchurch West suggested in his comments, when an election is over, when the pageantry is finished, we have to govern. And so I would like us to not frame this as, well, you're giving here, you're giving there. These are investments in people at all stages in their life cycle, at all stages in their lives, at all livelihoods that people choose, with all the choices that people make, with all the circumstances that people may not choose but have to live with. These are investments in people. I had occasion in my final 30 seconds, sir, to explain to a colleague this morning who took exception to the breakfast program that is being rolled out in the Ministry of Education. And that individual suggested that this might be a wasteful exercise and that there are children that do not need breakfast. And I said to them, I see the evidence from the Ministry of Education that says that 1 in 4 children show up to school without having had enough to eat. But I also know something else to a certainty. Targeting of young children for this kind of measure is not only more expensive than a universal approach to feeding young children, but it is also undesirable. Let those people who need the service show up and have access to it. That age group from pre-primary on, when children's brains are still struggling to grow, we know that nutrition matters most then. There are ways to avoid wastage in the system. There are ways to streamline programs. But let us understand that these are investments in young children who there's no measure, there's no reform that the Ministry of Education can bring that a hungry child can absorb. So I ask us to see these measures and this approach as a series of investments in our people. Yes, there are some that target business. Yes, there are some that are going to relate to the energy sector. Yes, there are some that are going to more focus on the household. These all come together. This is the transformation that we need to see in this country to make sure that we can count ourselves as good stewards of the time and the energy and the land and the resources that we have been given to be able to act as custodians for the generations to come. Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to you.